Okay. Okay, so as a reminder, this is being recorded and will be posted online. And today we're gonna mostly discuss paint timing. As in the last couple of weeks, there have been amazing progress happening on the spec and on various issues. So I wanted to discuss the remaining issues and make sure they come to a close. But let's start with some admin-related stuff. Do we have a volunteer for scribing?
I've already started a bit, so I'll continue.
Awesome. And I don't know if you all saw the email, but Nick is stepping up to serve as a co-chair for the working group. So congrats, Nick, and looking forward to continuing to work together. And like awesome times ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I am here to serve.
Thank you for your service.
Absolutely.
And otherwise, the last item on the administration, like on the list of main administrative things, is that the next call will be. Oh, we have a lot of folks joining. The next call will be on April 9th, same time as now. If anyone has reservations regarding that, please let me know. And if anyone has any particular conflict. And with that, I believe we're out of administrative things to talk about. So let's start talking about paint timing. So I've put a bunch of issues on the agenda. Noam, do you want to drive the discussion in some particular order, or should I just go over them one by one and we'll discuss them in the order that they're in?
What I suggest is that we split the issues to one of them, some of them are more about the definition of what's contentful and what should be considered for the different markings, and the other ones are kind of separate. But I guess anyway, they're kind of sorted that way.
Yeah, I sorted them as issues that I thought still require some discussion, and issues that are, either can be closed or very close to that state.
Why don't you take it the way you thought? It doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't matter that much.
Okay, so I will try to present my screen. And go over the issues that way. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So let's start off with the first item on the list, issue 54. Clarify what happens to a page which consists of just an iframe. So Noam or Ryosuke, do one of you want to sum up this issue?
Well, so I started pointing out the issue that what happens if the page just had a iframe, and then that morphed into discussion about cross-origin iframes. The problem is, I think maybe we should retitle that, but the problem is that in WebKit, the initial painting time is gated by mainframe's content. So if the iframe can figure out when the initial painting time is, then they can basically it leaks the information about mainframe's content is what it is. So I think we probably need to do something like a disable in cross-origin iframes.
Okay, so let me see if I understand you correctly. You're saying that the fact that we're exposing paint times in cross-origin iframes can, in some browsers or some architectures, expose information about the main origin paints, and therefore...
That's right.
Yeah. Nicholas and Benjamin, do you know if this is something that is true in other architectures?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Do you mean that we don't know when the paint occurred for the iframe itself?
So, basically, I'm wondering if there's like, for example, in the at least on desktop in Chrome, I'd be surprised if paintings between the cross-origin iframe, which is in a separate process, and the mainframe are somehow correlated.
Yeah, so in Chrome we look at what painted in the render process of the frame, and so we are able to tell. Oh, sorry, there's some echo. We're able to tell that the content painted was from the iframe, if that makes sense.
Wait, I don't follow. What do you mean by that?
So if we have a cross-origin iframe, well, I mean, that also has its notion of painting in the renderer process, right? So we use that notion to compute the first paint of that iframe.
Yeah, and in Chrome's architecture, I think that this also, like, that notion is completely separate from the paints that happen in the mainframe. Where, if I understand Ryosuke correctly, in WebKit, that's not necessarily the case, and mainframe paints can influence cross-origin iframe paints, right?
Well, in fact, it's not just the influence. The mainframe's content exactly determines when the initial paint for all the frames in the page happens. So that is problematic.
Oh, is it because of the delayed, like the fact that you don't paint until you feel like you're ready to paint? Is this?
That's right.
Okay, I see.
Okay.
I suggested a model where you could query for the current document or window whether first contentful paint would be available for that window. And then from my end, I think it's okay if different browsers decide on different security parameters for which window is allowed to mark first contentful paint.
So you could already do this by marking supported entry types to not contain paint for any iframe that is cross-origin at least.
Right.
Right. Well, so that's the way the current discussion is, which is that the spec doesn't currently allow that. So maybe we need to allow that in the spec.
Yeah, so basically allowing in the spec to have browsers not expose paint timings for cross-origin iframes.
or for any frame for that matter. I would say that
it might be clean that way.
I would say that we should mention that the supported entry types is valid for the current browsing context, and that it doesn't guarantee that it will be supported for other browsing contexts. We can discuss like the exact wordings on pull requests if we agree on the general direction.
But supported entry types is not paint timing, right? So are you suggesting changing the performance timeline?
Paint timing does say that it adds that supported entry types should return paint.
Oh, okay. So you would say then should report paint for any
for the current browsing context. If it would report first paint and/or first contentful paint. Yeah.
Right.
I don't remember where we ended up with basically we have like we had the frozen array that is hanging off of document for the supported entry types.
No,
it's really supported to have multiple, I think, multiple like different values of supported entry types for different contexts. We support that, so that should be fine.
Okay. Okay.
Because it's linked to the global object, but that's basically the window. So yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
So would that address the concerns that from that issue, Ryosuke, or not?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's not great that the different browsers would behave differently, but I mean, I don't know how else we'll resolve that. Right. I mean, short of like faking some numbers or something like that, which also
that's probably not ideal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think saying that it's not supported is better than saying that it's supported and then providing invalid values. Okay, cool. So I think we have agreement here, and we can move on to the next issue. Okay, next issue 57, allow optional implementation of first paint. Because of, if I'll try to sum it up, from WebKit's perspective, first paint and first contentful paint are supposed to happen at the same time due to various heuristics. And therefore, WebKit is not interested in implementing first paint. Is that a correct description, Ryosuke?
Yeah, so that's the sort of one reason. Another reason is that we think that first paint is like sort of bad metrics to optimize for, right? Because you can make a trade-off between the first paint and the first contentful paint, and you really want people to be optimized for first contentful paint, because like it's not great if website made the first paint faster at the cost of making the first contentful paint slower. So I think that's another argument, which is that it will be more clear to just report the metrics that people should be optimizing for. But additionally, in the case of WebKit, like they should really be same. If they're different, that's we'll probably consider as a bug. So
okay.
I mean, from Chrome, I think it like both of them. No, both of them make sense. I do understand the concerns from WebKit, but I do think first paint has some value. No, almost no value if you already use first contentful paint, but like the time basically when it's similar to the time when you have finished parsing the document and like have your first rendering lifecycle ready. I think it would be reasonable to allow it to be optional. I just don't know exactly how that would look in the spec, and if we need to provide further developer to basically make sure that it's something that developers can detect easily.
So what that means, I think, is that the supported entry type needs to be like a difference between first paint and first contentful paint. Because otherwise you won't be able to feature detect, right?
Or have another feature detection function for this. I do like the ideas of having them as separate entry types. Having first paint and first contentful paint as names doesn't fit how name is used in any other place. Like in
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
In resource timing, name is the URL, and in user timing, name is something that the user sets. It's usually not a constant. And here it's used like a constant. It feels a little like we had a field, so let's go with it. But maybe it should just be separate types.
From my perspective, separate types make sense, and then they will, enable just to use supported entry types rather than have
supported paint entry names.
Yeah, I don't know what, but yeah.
I mean,
it seems cleaner to split them. The main question would be from a compatibility, like from a web compat perspective. What will we like? We can support paint, I guess. Like continue to support paint and then deprecate it as the entry type on which people register, and just translate it to, two registrations.
I do worry, like, would we ever be able to deprecate paint? It is very widely used, and so I worry that if we're, like, I agree that from like the perspective of looking at it from as if it's like a new API, I think it makes sense to have the two entry types, but if Chrome were to implement this, then we would definitely need to support both ways. And it's not clear to me if we would be able to deprecate the other way. So it feels clumsier than adding the supported paint types, to me at least. I don't know.
But I mean, this API hasn't shipped in other browsers, right? So like websites would have to adapt to new API anyway.
Well, it's a different kind of adapt, right? Because it's simply feature detection versus this, which is breaking changes to the existing implementation.
Yeah, it would be nicer if we don't have like if we can avoid making breaking changes. Timo, I think you raised a hand in chat. Is that?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what need there is to do feature detection. So from a developer perspective, on Wikipedia, for example, we asked for the paint timing, and we know that the array might or might not contain first contentful paint. Like it contains 0 or more entries as far as I know, some of which will have a name of first paint, some of which will have a name of first contentful paint. Older Chrome didn't have contentful paint either. So we know that both of those are optional. At least for me as a developer, I didn't think that the spec said they were both mandatory. I only realized that relatively recently. What kind of breakage do we expect if first paint were to be missing from that array? Like the way the API works is like it's just a flat array. There's not like a key value pair where somebody could accidentally expect the key to exist. So I'm kind of curious, like what kind of code do we foresee where like it could actually break?
Yeah, I think that's precisely my point, that making first paint optional seems relatively fine from a developer perspective, but the suggestion was to change the entry type name. So observing for paint would no longer work. So that would definitely break all of the existing users, because then you would need to change to observe first paint and or first contentful paint, right? So that is a much more breaking change. Perhaps what you're saying is that maybe there's no need to do any additional feature detection, because if you already see first contentful paint and there's no first paint, then obviously first paint is not supported in the user agent, right? And yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what I meant to say, is that the API is quite nicely designed in that you start listening for something and you get an array of any entries. There could be entries in there that you don't recognize, and there could be some entries not in there. It does make it a little bit harder to use than compared to the old nav timing interface, where you just have nice key value pairs. That's very simplistic, but it also requires everything to exist up front. And I think the API that we have right now is quite ideal to allow things to be made optional. So I certainly wouldn't mind.
I gotta say that as a general, I'm concerned about this compatibility concern in a case of API that only ship in one browser, right? Because if we did that, that means as soon as any browser ships any feature, like we can't change the API. That's not gonna work.
So with my Chromium hat on, I don't think that we're saying that this is impossible to change because it's currently shipped. And we can definitely figure out a way to migrate from the current API to a more desirable future API. But at the same time, there is a cost. And from what I'm hearing across the room, the virtual room, is that there's no clear use case for a feature detection that this breaking change will enable.
And I want to add to that I don't think it's fair to say that we're opposing changes, because we've made a bunch of spec changes that we are not compliant with regarding the definition of contentful. So we will need to change our implementation for that. But this is a much more breaking change, and I don't see the value being like much higher than the actual cost. So that's what I'm concerned with here.
In the current API, you're getting different types when you listen, right? And then you have to check what you get. So I don't really see what's the upside here. Do we want to allow the people only get those specific subtypes by having a more fine-grained listening option? Like, what does it add to not have just paint as a listening type, but have others?
I think it's more about knowing what to expect. Like you got your, you know not to expect first paint, for example, if you know it's not coming. Like I can imagine code that would expect first paint and then first contentful paint. Like you would want a way to know not to expect that, but to expect something different. However, I don't find it crucial, personally. Like I think that the way the way performance timeline in general is built with types and names is already set up for optionality. I don't think it's about like the previous implementation in Chrome. It's just about a performance timeline built in a way where things are iteratively added. And maybe the spec should just say that supported entry type of paint doesn't guarantee a particular entry names to come. And maybe in the future we can think about more feature detection if it's needed.
See, that's the part I would object to. I think if you're saying that like we don't want to change the type because there's some compact concern for one browser that just shipped this API, and that in the future we can add a separate mechanism, I would object to that. Like, I don't think we should do it. If it's the case that there is any use case or any breakage where websites need to be able to detect those two cases, we should be changing type, not adding random new way to feature detect.
Okay. The way I see the API right now, that feature detection is not necessary.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I agree that if we would want to feature detect, it's better to go ahead with the current feature detection mechanism and figure out a plan to do whatever it takes to make sure that it won't become a compatibility concern. But at the same time, I don't really see a need for user detection. And I think that we have a clear signals from folks in the room that actually use the API that it's not something that they ever thought was needed. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that sounds okay to me. I think then we only spec issue remaining is to update the spec to allow first paint to be optional.
Yeah. Sounds good to me from my perspective.
So would this allow other types? Like, for instance, I was talking about this in a Bugzilla entry, but we have we have two metrics. We have a first paint and we have a full paint, and we're thinking of adding the first contentful paint. So would that allow us to add first paint and full paint as optional here?
I think I was in the thought that every browser should have their own paint timing names, but I think it's best if you want to add full paint that it's defined in the spec what it means. The same way we did for first contentful paint, that now first contentful paint is defined rigorously, like this is what it means. Then we can agree on it, and it can be an interoperable definition rather than a like Mozilla specific, WebKit specific metric.
Yeah, but so I agree that if Mozilla wants to add a third paint metric to this, it would make sense to like specify the same way that we now did for first contentful paint. But from an API shape perspective, it seems like something that can be just exposed similarly to the other two.
Yep.
Peter?
Yeah, also just to pitch in from the development perspective, we expected in any case, as some of the other people here in the room have said, we expected that, for example, some versions might have first paint, some others might not. So I just want to say that I also agree with, we can continue on with what we have, and yeah, we'll see about the compatibility types later on.
Thank you. Okay. So do we have agreement to make first paint optional in the spec? And can we move on to the next issue?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So next issue is issue number 58. Clarify whether first contentful paint considers content outside the viewport. Ryosuke, do you want to summarize the issue, or should I?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's pretty straightforward, which is that thing whether. Well, first off, we have to first figure out what the viewport means, right? There are many different kinds of viewports. We're talking here, like a layout viewport, visual viewport, and so on and so forth. And the second of detecting whether something's in a viewport or not is not easy. It's actually pretty tricky to do. Although the intersection observer defines some mechanism to decide what happens there. So I think the question is, I think there was a discussion about we will consider things that's outside a viewport as a part of the first paint anyway. But then there are cases where web page you have content for accessibility purposes. For example, it was a very common technique to have the text of the with the negative, I don't know, negative 1,000 pixels, text indent or whatever, to have a text and then pulling the background image. Pulling the hero image as the background image. So in those cases, if the text is drawn there, like user still don't see anything. So it's not great to consider as a first paint, right? Sorry, could everyone else mute? I think there's echoing going on there. And there are few other cases where content outside of viewport really is not something user would ever see. So I think the latest discussion is on that and a few other related cases.
So I thought this was already solved by Noam's suggestion to clip the bounding rect with the scrolling area. Is that not the case?
Yes, the current version that's up clips with a scrolling area, which means that if something is in minus 10,000, it wouldn't be considered contentful. So contentful paint is anything that the user can potentially get to by scrolling.
I guess that also depends on the directionality of the page. So it's the left for LTR and it's the right for RTL.
Right. So so the scrollable area of the document already has that in mind.
Does the scrollable area works with the visual viewport or layout viewport?
It doesn't have a viewport. The scrollable area is anything, is the whole scrollable area. It's as if your viewport was from 0, 0 to infinite.
Okay, so it doesn't take the viewport into consideration. This is about the root box.
Yeah, the root box.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think this is the sort of viewport part is the open question, right? Like,
but if we don't care about the viewport and just say that any paint within the scrollable area is, contentful, and any paint outside of it is not, then we don't need to define which viewport we don't care about, because we don't care about all of them.
I guess that is one conclusion we can come to if we wanted to. I think that
but since you're opposed to using an undefined viewport, we shouldn't talk about the viewport at all because we're not going to define it here, right? So I think the clipping with the scrolling area is sufficient clarification that things that are not within the document scrolling area will not count, whereas anything that does clip with the scrolling area can potentially count as contentful, and there's no need to like reference the viewport at all.
I mean, I agree. The current scrollable area is a precise definition, but I don't think it necessarily means that we don't have to consider viewport. I mean, I think we could collectively decide that viewport is irrelevant, but I don't think it's anyway inherently clear that we don't want to consider viewport, right? Like, if the paint happens and the user don't see anything because things that got painted was completely outside viewport, is that really still useful to count as a first paint and first contentful paint? To be fair, there's one argument to be made for ignoring viewport, which is that if you consider viewport, then depending on the size of the user's window and which part user is scrolled to, the matrix of first paint and first contentful paint will be affected, right? Because if the user happens to not include the content that gets painted at the very beginning, it will report that like later, when some other content gets painted.
Yeah.
Whereas if you did only consider the scrollable root scrollable area, then or things in a root box that's in a root scrollable area, then it will be more consistent across different window size and so forth. So that's, I think, one benefit of going with the scrollable area. I think I think maybe the people who are using this metric can comment, give us some feedback about that.
Suppose I could say something. I think it's a very interesting consideration. Like, for example, do we want to punish websites if I open them on a very small screen? If we include the viewport, that means contentful paint might never happen because the content is outside what I can see. So I guess it's a distinction between, do we want to say it's when the first content is available to the user or is actually visual to the user? Those are two very different directions. I guess it is intuitive for the user to see it. That's kind of what you would first expect, but it also means that it would be, actually, I would like to hear from the browser vendors on this. Like, would it be very expensive to have to compute whether something is in the visual viewport? That presumably would potentially add non-trivial costs, right? Like, that might be a deal breaker, I don't know.
It's already computed for an intersection observer, and a way to specify it that I can imagine would be to say a first contentful paint would be at the time where a contentful element intersects with the viewport in the same way as intersection observer would work.
Right, but I think the question is whether it would be expensive performance-wise. It's certainly possible.
I think once,
but
sorry.
Sorry, that's it.
I think it starts being really weird when you think about what happens after. Like, if something paints outside of viewport and that's the only thing, then does that mean that we have a first contentful paint when the person scrolls to it? And then that becomes like a metric that's dependent on user action, which really sucks when you're trying to compare sessions between users. Like, sometimes it's something that was independent of their action if it happens to be inside the viewport, and sometimes they had to wait until they scroll to it for that paint timing to happen, so they can't compare both. To me, that's the strongest argument to ignore the viewport boundaries, so that the metric is consistent regardless of the viewport size that the user has decided to use.
I'm also struggling to find cases other than the one that we already ruled out by using the scrollable area, where content will paint outside the viewport, outside the initial viewport, but not inside of it. Do you have any real-life examples in mind?
Sorry, could you clarify what you mean by that?
So I think that typically when the content will first paint, it will first paint like in the order of the document, which means that the initial viewport is typically painted first. At least that's most of the pages that I go to. I wonder if you have real life examples where there are exceptions to that.
Absolutely. Many Wix sites when I worked there had a huge background image on above the fold and the text below the fold. So if that background image takes a long time to load, the first contentful paint will happen below the fold.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I think the hero image, big hero image, or like the the website with like a design such that the first part of the viewport is like, I guess the hero image. Yeah, I think that's the common case, right?
I still think though that the Paint API should be as much as possible separate from user interaction and more tied to loading time. It can't be 100%, but like what Jill was saying, that wherever we can have the Paint API related to the content rather than to the interaction, it's better.
Yeah, I think the avoiding interaction with the avoiding dependency in the user interaction seems might be the strongest argument against taking the viewport into consideration. So that like when a user resizes or scrolls, it won't affect the first contentful paint.
Yeah, I agree.
Is it worth defining another event for when the user first scrolls into visible content? Is that something that could be easily calculated and is maybe orthogonal to first contentful paint?
The problem with user-dependent metrics is that they are very hard to reason about because different users do different things. And if the metrics goes up or down, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about what you're doing versus the site's UI, like maybe changing, or maybe the user population is changing in some weird way. So it's very hard to reason about that in a performance context.
I think that metric exists, and it's intersection observer.
Also
like,
true. Yes.
Like the user, there could be a JavaScript library to use intersection observer and find what's contentful and what's not. While the performance API should be about websites and how they behave rather than that.
Yeah, I just want to add, I do think it's true that websites should be punished if they're showing stuff outside the viewport and that's the only thing they ever see. That's probably something worth optimizing for and highlighting in some way to developers, but maybe not as part of this API. I think that would conflate different purposes too much.
Somewhere in the list of suggestions for that API, we have attribution for the paint. And so if that ever happens, then people should be able to look up what the element was and where it was. So that would kind of solve it in that sense.
Yeah.
Attribution in what?
Of knowing which element got painted with the first contentful paint. That's like an old idea of like maybe you would like to do that at some point. But if you had the attribution, then you could look up where the element is compared to viewport. If as a developer you're interested in knowing was that actually in the viewport or not.
One problem with that is that there can be many first elements, right? But yeah.
Yeah, sure. That's a little other kind of worms. I don't want to get into attribution right now. I'm just saying, maybe there's a solution from a developer's perspective down the road for that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Going back to the issue, I noticed there's also a note that says, I quote, "As a general rule, an element is paintable if it is within the viewport, or can potentially be in the viewport as a result of scrolling or zooming." Although it's a non-normative note, so I guess my question is, what else is missing to close this issue? I don't want to close it myself, obviously, but
I think we have to probably get rid of all the reference to all these notes that references a viewport, right? Because we just decided that okay, we don't want to consider viewport.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just just clear out those references, and then like from my perspective, I think we're good to close that once that happens. Let me just, so there's, we have a few references that we need to clear out. Okay, so Nicholas, will you be able to send a PR that clears the spec from those notes? Or is there already a PR up in the air on that?
I don't think there's a PR. I think the note that I read is kind of useful, but if we're really opposed to having viewport in a non-normative note, then I guess we can close it. Because I guess and there is one mention outside of non-normative notes, so we should definitely remove that one as well.
So okay, so I see what you're saying regarding the note. Maybe we can rephrase it to say that an element is paintable inside or outside of the viewport as long as the user can scroll to it at some point, which is
that's kind of what it says. Huh?
Almost what it says. We can we can make it clearer, I guess, and then.
But I mean, the point is, if you don't want to use viewport, how do you word it, right?
Oh no, I mean, I don't think we have to literally get rid of the term viewport, right? I think that the particular note you wrote about general element is paintable if it can be scrolled to or zoomed. That I think that would be okay.
Okay. Okay. Having that, then I can remove the rest, and the other mentions of viewport don't seem necessary.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah. Cool. Although, to be fair, this viewport thing should really defer to as either layout viewport or visual viewport, but yeah.
Okay, cool. And with the 8 minutes we have left, let's try to tackle the next one. The next issue we have on the list is issue 38. Be more precise about first paint versus first contentful paint. Nicholas, do you want to cover this one, or?
Yeah, so, well, I filed that a long time ago, but I think the processing logic just is a little bit too informal. Because when you mark the paint timing, you just say, okay, was this a first paint? But how do you know that? And then there's no way to keep track of the fact that the document already made the first paint or the first contentful paint. So I think some improvement could be done to keep track of that. I'm not sure if we need to discuss it or if there's any.
Yeah,
this seems purely editorial.
Yeah, so we can just fix that. Okay, so moving on to the next one. Issue 75, should transparent alpha value 0 text be considered contentful?
Yeah, so there was some discussion about this. I think there is a consensus that transparent text should not be contentful, and the discussion was about text decorations, like text shadow, underlines, text emphasis.
Yeah.
In the PR, I brought forward text and text. That's in the case where they have color, where the text is transparent, but the text decoration has its own color. So in the PR, I proposed a text shadow would be contentful, but underline strokes text emphasis wouldn't, because it doesn't contain glyphs. Like you can't read it. You can't read the text from that, but you can from text shadow. And
yeah. So I've kind of started thinking that maybe that we should not have a special treatment for transparent text, because a user could still select them and interact with those texts.
Right.
Well, this was actually suggested by Marcus from Mozilla. So I wonder if Mozilla can comment on whether they would be fine including that, because right now from the code that Marcus sent, the text that is transparent is excluded from the list of painted elements or something like that. So I don't know if it's feasible to just include them, and then that way Mozilla would be able to implement the first contentful paint, including those as well.
Benjamin, are you familiar with the?
Yeah, I'll ask Marcus about that. I don't know off the top of my head.
Overall,
so where is this? Sorry, where can I find this comment?
It was a comment in the viewport issue. I have a reference to it in that issue.
Yeah, issue 58.
Yeah. There were comments in issue 58, and then I opened another issue because it's a different issue. Comments, yeah, one of the comments.
Yeah, the comment also mentions about scales and opacity in general.
Oh wait, that's the comment. It was for the one from Marcus.
Yeah.
I guess from my perspective, it's very hard, it's potentially hard for users to distinguish between text that is completely opaque to text that is, has a opacity value of 0.001, or text that is, has very low contrast compared to its background. So it might be easier to skip all that. And I think Ryosuke's comment about the text selection actually makes a very good point, because this text is eventually visible to the user, or potentially visible.
Yeah, so also my point is that if the user had selected all entire content by Command A or Control A or whatever, you could still copy the text, right? So you could argue that it's contentful, at least in semantic sense.
For what it's worth, I can also imagine certain games using invisible text, maybe something that only is accessible to speech readers and things like that. Yeah. Accessibility is also important in that regard. So I can see the argument for things that are nearly invisible. Like, why would we treat those differently? It's the same to the user who can see.
Yeah, but I think in the case people put the text for accessibility, they usually put it off screen too, right? So yeah, I think that might be a slightly different case. But yeah, to be fair, I don't necessarily feel strongly either way. I have to talk to my colleagues and see if any of them have some strong opinions. But I think this is sort of like interesting edge case to consider.
I also don't feel strongly about it, so we should talk a bit more to the Mozilla folks that presented the issue. and then decide based on that.
Could you CC them, since you seems to be aware of the people who have commented about that issue? So
Sure.
what I mean is CC them an issue 75.
Yep, will do.
Okay, awesome. So we are out of time. Thank you all so much, and I am hoping to see the work continue on paint timing, and I'm hoping we can reach an issue list of 0 issues very soon.
Yeah, well,
so
well,
often.
zero, not sure about 0, but we're making great progress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Exciting. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice day.